I guess I'm doing this now, huh? Nah, man, it's alright. It's all good. You know, you're not mad. You're just disappointed. Okay. Alright, well, here we go. Play the music! See, that's that good shit right there. This is a game I desperately wanted to love. The hype for this game during its pre-release was unreal. After years and years of demand, we were finally getting a remake of the much-beloved Final Fantasy VII. That reveal trailer was on par with the reveal for Twilight Princess during E3 2004. It's one of the strongest reveals in history. But sure enough, it wouldn't be long for this remake to deal with its own share of controversy. The fact that this remake would be split up into multiple parts, the change from turn-based combat to real-time action, fans, understandably, had their concerns. In the case of the multiple episode structure, the developers justified this by saying that they have so many ideas and ways to flesh out Midgar itself, how this would be as long as a typical Final Fantasy game, and how there would be side quests that could potentially double that playtime. Then word got out that this game would have an install disc, and it really did seem as if this game would be that massive. With that said, there was always this fear that I had that this remake would never be complete. Not necessarily that this game wouldn't be finished, but they won't be able to finish remaking what was left of Final Fantasy VII after Midgar. If this was true, that Midgar itself would be a 30-hour-long game, then what would that mean for the rest of the episodes? Would we get a 40-hour-long game based around the events of Rocket Town, or the City of the Ancients, or Cosmo Canyon? Sounds unlikely, but Final Fantasy VII is a massive game with lots of things to do. It's on 3 discs for a good reason. This fear I had was only made much more stronger when the highly anticipated Last of Us 2 was indefinitely delayed. It doesn't matter how high profile that your game is or who's backing it. None of that matters when anything can happen at any time, however unlikely it may seem. Furthermore, if we look back at Final Fantasy XV and its DLC, it raises even more concerns. Final Fantasy XV was supposed to have 2 major waves of DLC, the second of which would add new and important story details, more character-specific chapters, and even a new ending, among other things. When the director of that game left Square Enix, all but one portion of that DLC was scrapped. Well, kind of. The story information is now being adapted into a book, but the point still stands. Anything can happen, and just because it's Final Fantasy VII doesn't mean it's immune from failure. But sure enough, despite my concerns and fears, I bought the game day one. Now, I didn't grow up with the original Final Fantasy VII, but it's a game that I still love nonetheless. It's aged in a number of ways, so I can understand why people who haven't played the original can't get into it. Shoddy localization, jank controls, random encounters, slow battles, and it can be pretty difficult to know where you're supposed to go. These pre-rendered backgrounds might have been impressive for the time, but unfortunately, they haven't held up. But if you can look past this game's age, you'll find a game that's packed to the brim with things to do, surprisingly deep mechanics thanks to the materia system, a world with a rich history and an emotional and personal story that, rocky translation aside, can still tug at the heartstrings. While there are a lot of aspects that have aged, there are still plenty of others that have stood the test of time. But again, people can't get into the original game, and it's not hard to see why. All the more reason why I was excited for this remake to come out. Now people who couldn't get into the original Final Fantasy VII now have a chance to see what the world of Gaia has in store. They can now see what makes Final Fantasy VII so special. Or so I thought. Guys, like, I'm not hating on this game just because it's popular and just to hate it. Guys, it brings me no joy to say that this game, this Final Fantasy VII Remake, is one of the most soul-crushing experiences I've had this generation. This is one of the most disappointing games that I've ever played. So before I get into what bothers me about this game, I do want to talk about the things that this game does right. And believe me, there's actually quite a bit to talk about. So if we're going to get the superficial stuff out of the way, you know, the stuff that people say, oh, well, the graphics don't matter, it's all about the gameplay, hurdy-dur, I don't know what I'm talking about. If we're going to get that stuff out of the way, then let me just say this. This game is absolutely stunning. There were many a times where I would just stop to look around, to take time to appreciate the massive scope of the game. This game is huge, and the sheer scale of it all is nothing to scoff at. It's rich with its attention to detail, and I could stare at the stuff for hours. Character models are some of the best that you'll find on the PS4, with highly detailed and expressive facial animations, and of course, very attractive and appealing designs. I was playing this game with my sister, and whenever Cloud or Reeve or Reno would appear, she would fangirl. I mean, like, look at these people. They're fucking gorgeous. But don't worry. Don't you worry. Whenever Tifa or Aerith or Jessie came on, I was like,
so then, what can I get you?
oh! Like, it's crazy how good this game can look at times. Like, sometimes I forget that I'm looking at people who don't really exist. Jesus Christ. Speaking of the characters, they are written incredibly well here. It seemed as if the days of Advent Children, where the characters felt like gross exaggerations of their stereotypes, are gone. These characters feel true to themselves. Cloud is cool, blunt, sarcastic, and to the point, but deep down, he's a total doofus and a complete softie. Barrett, who was one of my favorite characters in the original game, is done justice here. I was worried that they would mess around with this character to be more modern and more appropriate, but he feels the way how he does in the original, and I think that is incredibly important. He's a hard ass who doesn't take shit from no one, on top of being the ideal dad. Now, if I were to ever have kids of my own, I could only hope to be as good as a dad as he is. He's one of the very few fatherly role models I could think of in fiction, one that's done well, and I'm glad that they kept that intact. And of course, thankfully, they got Aerith done perfectly here. She has a heart of gold and seems pure in every way, but every once in a while, this can happen.
You worry too much. I'm not some princess who needs to be coddled. Shit.
Rest assured, I had a hefty Ryan laugh at that part. She likes to tease Cloud from time to time and is always eager to help out others, even if it's someone who she only just met. The fact of the matter is, these characters are written very well and they are done justice here. The music will probably win the award for Best Soundtrack during this year's Game of the Year awards. If we still have them, but that's not here or there. I have my qualms with it, but, we'll get there. But the quality here is through the roof. Square Enix is kind of like Sonic the Hedgehog in that regard. Even when the game is total shit, you can always count on the soundtrack being really good. Look, I'm going to be honest, I've always had a hard time describing music. I was never really musically qualified for this kind of stuff. But I'm sure you already know how great the music is in this game. But then again, we'll talk a bit more about the problems that I have with it later on. The thing I love most about this remake is the battle system. I never did mind the change from the turn-based system to something that's more action-focused. Now, while I still don't have a problem with games being turn-based or games with random encounters, this was a change I feel was justified. Now, especially with Nomura at the helm, he knows exactly how to make action RPGs hella fun. But, don't worry, we're gonna put a pin on him. You know exactly why. This battle system though, man, they absolutely nailed it here. Being able to swap between the characters on the fly has gotten me out of a tight pinch on numerous occasions. A problem that I have is that I noticed that your party's AI is kinda sorta dumb. Like if I'm running low on health and they have a heal materia equipped, I'd think that they would take the initiative and heal me, but instead, I'd have to swap to that character and heal that way. But there's probably something that I missed. There's probably like an option somewhere in the menu where it's like, oh, well, you can make your characters act more defensively, or, you can make them act more offensively, you can make them heal. There's probably something that I missed, so that's on me, if anything. Like, if there isn't, then it's a problem with the game, but if you're going to tell me that there's something there, that's on me. I'll own it. Thankfully, when you use items or cast spells or unleash special attacks, this game will go into a slow-mo mode, allowing you to take a quick breather from all the chaos to reevaluate your strategy. The bosses in this game, with a few exceptions, are nothing short of stellar. I love how they're able to take some of the throwaway enemies from the original game and make them into fully fledged boss fights. The fight with the Hell House, of all things, ended up being my favorite boss in the entire game. He has a lot of moves up his sleeve, and seeing how during this fight you only have yourself and Aerith, it led to an intense and rewarding fight. Really, this whole segment with the Dawn and Wall Market was the best part of the game. The team did an excellent job expanding this segment by introducing new characters and giving you new things to do. Throughout the entire duration of this chapter, I was laughing and smiling like an idiot. Whether it was wanting to give Johnny a hug and tell him that he's doing his very best, or if I was watching my boy Cloud become a man, this chapter was a highlight in every sense of the word. Thankfully, this isn't the only chapter that fleshes things out. There was this other chapter where you and the Avalanche trio, Jesse, Biggs, and Wedge, raid a Shinra warehouse. You start out by getting a taste of the motorcycle gameplay, you get a heartbreaking backstory with Jesse, Biggs and Wedge providing backup when things go sour, and there's this fun as hell boss battle with this new character, Roche. He was a joy to fight and a blast to watch him in action. This remake fleshes out a lot of things that didn't need to be fleshed out, but it only works in this game's favor. Reimagined boss fights, a deep battle system that lets you upgrade weapons, and I could use the Buster Sword throughout the entire game if you really wanted to. Even after you beat the game, you get a chapter select mode, which made recording footage for this game a hell of a lot easier. There's a lot that this remake absolutely nails, and there's so much that I love about it. So then what the fuck happened? So we're going to start with some of these smaller things and then work our way up to some of the more major problems that I have. Some of these I am well aware are nitpicks, but all I can say is that I hope you can see where I'm coming from. So starting out, we have the music. It's great, don't get me wrong, but I'm not a fan of how they spoiled pieces of music that you'd hear after you leave Midgar in the original game. When I heard the overworld theme play when I was in the Sector 7 slums, I had a fanboy moment. It was beautiful, but then I asked myself, wait, why is this playing here, of all places? There's a few other times where this happens, and for me, it kind of takes away the point of those tracks. It feels as if they're only here because, hey, look, it's that song from Final Fantasy VII. You remember that? We're trying to be like Final Fantasy VII. We're trying to be like the original game. Like, they didn't ask themselves whether or not it'd be appropriate for the given situations, and they'd only put it here to tickle your nostalgia bone, which, sure, it's a remake, I get it. But to me, it kind of defeats the purpose of those tracks. Like in part 2 when we get to explore Gaia. Are we going to reuse the same track or what? You know, on that note, speaking of reusing tracks, this game has a hard-on for those who fight. The original battle theme for the original Final Fantasy VII. It's an iconic theme, of course, but it feels as if every action piece has some sort of rendition of this track. I mean, they're all good, they're all well made, don't get me wrong. But there came a point in the game where I said, alright guys, I get it, that's enough. Is it a nitpick? Sure, but it's only one straw on the camel's back. Secondly, and this was actually taking place during the pre-release period, so this was kind of like a red flag for me, but I was never a fan of how Sephiroth was so prominent during the promotional material, and in that sense, how his presence was increased in the remake. In the original early game, Sephiroth is only mentioned by name, how he's an iconic war hero and how Cloud wants to be like him someday. Then you have to try to escape the Shinra building, and you see the corpse of the Shinra president with a massive blade plunged into his body. And even before that, when you're making your way over there, you can see trails of blood. Like blood, not weird holographic goo, but red, human-like blood. And with the music that plays during this moment and the graphic imagery, it was pretty scary for PS1 standards. But the best part is that you never saw his face. You didn't need to know what he looks like. You just knew that he was a threat, and he was not to be reckoned with. When we see Sephiroth for the first time, it's during the flashback sequence in Kalm, the first village that you go to after you leave Midgar, and we get a taste of how powerful Sephiroth is because we get to join his party. At first, he seems mentally stable, he seems fine, but then revelations are had, and that causes him to go mad and burns down the entire village to the ground. That right there is effective. In the remake, it felt like as if we were constantly being reminded of Sephiroth every chapter, even if it wasn't appropriate. Like, there's not really any build-up towards this guy. There's no mystery. There's nothing. When the original game didn't have to do this, it makes it feel as if the only reason why the remake reminds you about Sephiroth is to show you things that you know. Again, it's like as if the game is trying to tickle your nostalgia bone. Look guys, it's the Final Fantasy VII Remake! Here's Sephiroth! Isn't he so cool? It's Final Fantasy VII! Now, remember how I gushed about how all the characters were done justice, about how the writers really understood these characters? It breaks my heart to say that Sephiroth, unfortunately, is the exception. Yes, we like Sephiroth, but we liked him because he was mysterious, and every time that he had a presence, it felt like a big deal. So much so that he didn't even have to physically be there. He could just leave a calling card in the form of a corpse, and that's all that you need. The original game didn't have to remind you of Sephiroth every 3 minutes, just to show you things that you know, and as such, it felt as if his presence was much more powerful and impactful on the PS1. But trust me, I have more to say about him, but we're saving that for later. I also think this game feels pretty, I don't know, I guess Western for lack of a better word. Like, there's a lot of moments where the game forces you to walk while the characters talk, or it'll pan the camera over to a point of interest, or it'll stop you in your tracks to show you something. Like, this might be the nittiest of nitpicks, I am aware, but when there are so many games that does this narrative experience thing, it gets old. Like, Spider-Man on PS4 does this, God of War on PS4 does this, Uncharted does this, The Last of Us does this. Like, I don't play JRPGs to have that, and as such, when you're forcing me to play a certain way, it kind of kills that replay value. It makes it feel as if I'm playing a Western action game and not a Japanese action RPG, if that makes any sense. Also, this game does that thing where, you try to explore where you're not supposed to, and it'll force you onto the path that you're supposed to go. Like, Pokemon games do that shit, and I bitch about it there, and I'm a bitch about it here too. I hate that shit. Let me explore. People complain about the points of no return, and it's true that there's so many here that it will make Golden Sun Dark Dawn blush, but the game does a good job of telling you when you're getting close to that point, and it'll let you go back to do some of the side stuff that you need to. Speaking of the side content, now, from what I've experienced anyways, they weren't anything great, and that's a shame. Most of the ones that I found were, find some cats, kill some rats, find some kids who are running around, kill a big monster. Like, they're generic Skyrim quests, and I was expecting something a bit more. Now, I'll admit that I didn't do everything that this game has to offer, so there is a lot of stuff that I missed. I am aware, but the ones that I found were completely underwhelming and boring, and I didn't feel incentivized to go out and find those other quests. Which, unfortunately, is what makes the idea behind this remake fall apart. I think you can remake Final Fantasy VII and have Midgard be its own game, but I don't think they did a great job. Side quests aside, the main quest feels stretched out and bloated, not because the developers had so many cool ideas, but because they were running out of things for you to do. Entire chapters that can last upwards of 2 hours, feel like filler. The train graveyard is a segment in the original game that took maybe 20 or 30 minutes, but in the remake, it is much longer. Now, keep in mind, this is the point in the story where Cloud, Aerith, and Tifa have to rush to Sector 7 before the plate falls, and what are we doing? We're playing around with some ghosts? Hey guys, come on, let's speed it up, people are going to die and we're talking to ghosts. Like, come on, more people are going to be ghosts later if we don't hurry up. Or after Shinra kidnaps Aerith, what do? We go back in the sewers from an earlier chapter, refight the same boss that we did back then, and we all do all this just to find Dawn. Like, there's a tragic story here about how the guy helping you has a fiance that was taken by the Dawn, and now he has no idea where she is, so he wants to take revenge. That's a great story for a side quest. It gives you an excuse to go back to the sewers and refight the same boss. This will be better as optional content, not stuff that you have to do. And then it just keeps going. Like, chapter 15 is a massive climb where, you guessed it, in the original game it took roughly about 15 or so minutes, but here it's an entire chapter. The set pieces here are really cool, but it's hard to appreciate the scenery when you're constantly dealing with an endless horde of enemies. It was so bad that it actually made me appreciate random encounters. Because, at least in the games with random encounters, there'd be an item or a spell that can reduce or even sometimes fully nullify random encounters. But here, where you are scripted to fight certain enemies, it kind of defeats the purpose of not having random encounters in your games. It feels as if the fights in the later parts of the game only exist to pad out the game. Never is this more true than in chapter 17. You have to swap between two parties and you do nothing but fight enemies for Hojo in this bland, lifeless environment. Now, it's the point, it's supposed to look lifeless and dull and depressing and drab, I know, but I was falling asleep at this chapter. It got to a point where I gave the controller to my sister because I was just that bored of the game. You can cut this chapter out of the entire game and you'll lose nothing. Almost like as if the only reason why it's here is to, now say it with me, pad out the game. And the worst part is that, there are chapters that are stretched out, but there are even some new chapters that, they weren't in the original, but I think they're really good. Like, I mentioned the Shinra warehouse, I mentioned Wall Market, but there's this one chapter where you discover an underground Shinra facility, and it was really cool because it added some depth to the story. But unfortunately, after the plate falls on Sector 7, this game completely nosedives. This entire endgame, like I said, feels stretched out and padded out beyond belief. But this is also where the story takes a sharp turn for the worst. During some parts of the game, you'll be attacked by these ghostly apparitions, which I also want to point out that I was able to figure out what these things were before the revelation was had. Here's my proof. Boop. There you go. That's for you. These ghosts tend to swarm around people who, if you played the original game, are going to die. Aerith at one point has a line where she says that she believes that the future isn't always set in stone. Wedge survives the fall when he falls off the pillar, when he didn't in the original, but when he tries to escape, he's surrounded by these ghosts. These things, the Whispers, these Arbiters of Fate, as the game calls them, are here to keep the timeline of the original Final Fantasy VII in check. And that right there kills the remake in the Final Fantasy VII Remake. This game is not a remake. Say it with me now. This game is not a remake, and it's because of these things. This is more of a soft reboot or a pseudo-sequel. Point is, this remake cannot stand alone as its own thing because it desperately relies on you knowing the events of the original Final Fantasy VII. A true remake can't stand alone as its own game. Some are even so good that it completely outdoes the original in every way. It makes it feel as if going back to the original game is more of a novelty. Ocarina of Time 3D, the original Resident Evil remake, some of the Pokemon remakes, these are proper remakes. When you dramatically change the story and when you rely on the player to have prior knowledge of the original game, you fail as a remake. And when I say dramatically change the story, that feels like a massive understatement. Chapter 18 isn't a change to the story, it's a completely different book by a completely different writer. So we have these ghosts and they're supposed to keep the timeline in check, or, you know, something like that. And then we go to this place where we fight these godlike beings that control fate, and then we kill the god of fate itself, and then we have a boss fight with Sephiroth that comes out of nowhere and is straight from Advent Children, and then they spoil one of the best parts of the original game, and then we find out that Zack might even be alive, and Big somehow survived. Like, what is going on here? This was the chapter that made me turn on this remake. Like, before, like, there were problems with it, but like I could still see that it was a great game. Like I was having a lot of fun with it, but then this made me just turn my back on it. First off, you know, I want to say that the idea behind the Whispers isn't necessarily a bad one. It can absolutely work in something like Kingdom Hearts or in Final Fantasy 13, but in your Final Fantasy 7 remake, sure, you know, you see these Whispers early on, but what they are, their purpose, I'm sorry, this comes way out of nowhere, and it's jarring, and it doesn't work. It doesn't mesh very well. There's this one part where they get a flash forward, and, you know, they use clips from Advent Children. They actually use clips from the Advent Children movie, and then Cloud asks what that was, and then Naki says that these are visions of the future if we fail here, but here's the thing, though. Everything is okay in the future. I mean, yes, sacrifices are made and people do die, but the world is saved. They are destined to be victorious. That is their fate. So what are they trying to prevent? What are they fighting for? In the original game, right before Meteor hits and while the live stream is holding it back, what's the last thing that you see before the credits start to roll? Aerith is in the live stream, and she used Holy to save the planet. Death was such an important part of the original game. It was one of its core themes. You know, the themes of death, of loss, trying to cope with losing someone that you love and learning how to move on. These themes were put into the game because during the conceptual stages, Hironobu Sakaguchi lost his mother. This message, this story, this was a very personal project for him. Tetsuya Nomura, the one who designed the characters and who even has a writing credit in the original, was the one who supposedly suggested that they kill Aerith. But in the remake, like, nah, Biggs is still alive, guys, and Wedge dies, but he didn't. But then he does, but does he really? Jesse might even be alive, who knows? Whoa, Barrett got stabbed by Sephiroth. You didn't see that coming. Well, guess what? He's still alive. Look, it's Zack. You guys like Zack, right? Well, guess who's back? Or is he really? Like, no, you don't do that. I hate that. Like, in the original game, you don't even see Zack until, like, around the end of the second disc, so why is he even here? Like, that was a huge bombshell, and you're really just going to show us this in part 1 of your remake. Really? On that note, you really mean to tell me that the final boss of the first part of your Final Fantasy VII remake is Sephiroth? Really? You know, one of the coolest parts of the original Final Fantasy was at the end, where you go into Cloud's head and you see Sephiroth there waiting for you. It's you and him, one-on-one, and then you just fucking wail on the guy. After all the shit that he put you through, after all the heartbreak, the mental torture, the abuse, after all of that, you just obliterate this guy and you wipe him out of Cloud's head for good. So, what's the fight with Sephiroth trying to say in the remake? What's the point of it? It honestly feels as if it's only here for the fan service, but by doing so, Nomura completely misses the point of the original. And you know, a fight like this would have been greatly appreciated in Kingdom Hearts 3. You know, the numbered console Kingdom Hearts game that doesn't have a Sephiroth boss fight, but no, it's here, where it doesn't belong. And this is where the remake fails for me. It shows that Nomura and his team knows what the original game means to everybody. They knew how important it was. They knew how to write these characters, how to flesh out and explore some of the things that weren't well developed in the original. They knew all of this. So they led us on, and at the last possible moment, they pulled the rug from underneath their feet, and Nomura did what he does best. Overcomplicates things that were previously simple and easy to understand in a pathetic attempt to come off as deep, even though we all know that most of the time, he writes off the seat of his pants. Sure, he can do this to Kingdom Hearts, that's his baby. Sure, if he was put in charge of a numbered Final Fantasy game like Final Fantasy 16 or 17, that's fine, that's his project. But here, in Final Fantasy VII Remake, he went too far. This, to me, feels intentional. It felt like as if he wanted us to think that this would have been the thing that we've been asking for all this time, only to take it away from us at the last second. I'm sorry, maybe it's a little overdramatic, but it feels pretty mean. The worst part now is that, people who couldn't get into the original, they're shit out of luck. They were looking forward to playing this game, to see what made Final Fantasy VII so beloved by so many people, but now they can't. They were robbed of that opportunity. It feels as if these drastic changes were only made because of the point that, well, you can't spoil a 23-year-old game, so I'll show them. So Nomura did what he did, but as a result, as far as I'm concerned, it fails. Because of this, because of the things that happen in this game, the things that I strongly disagree with, these are all things that are going to have a large impact on future episodes. Because of this, again, people who can't get into the original game are now robbed of a proper Final Fantasy VII Remake. Which is why when people say, well, who cares, the original still exists, they end up looking like people who have no idea what they're talking about, and they come off as incredibly entitled. Others might say that it sounds like as if I'm asking for a remaster and not a remake, but that, frankly, isn't true. We already have remasters of Final Fantasy VII on the PS4, Switch, and even on your phone. Even the recent re-release of Final Fantasy VIII is called, oh, would you look at that? Final Fantasy VIII Remastered. People, myself included, wanted a proper Final Fantasy VII remake that fleshes out Midgar and expands on the lore of the world and kept the story and themes intact. Even to expand on the story a little bit, not to change it, but to enhance it. And can you really blame people for feeling the kind of vitriol they're currently feeling? Can you really blame people for getting this heated? When you call yourself Final Fantasy VII Remake, and then you end up being a pseudo-sequel, fans are going to feel misled and cheated. To put it as eloquently as my dear sister once put it, it felt like getting kicked in the balls. I mean, for God's sake, look at the box art. Look at the title, Final Fantasy VII Remake. Not Part 1, not Episode Midgar, nothing like that. Final Fantasy VII Remake. It's trying to lure you in by promising you a proper remake, but at the end, it ends up being more of Advent Children nonsense. Now, do I think Nomura should be fired over this? God, of course not. While I strongly, heavily disagree with the direction that he's taken this project, at the end of the day, this is his artistic vision. But with that said, I do feel as if something needs to be done here. Again, fans feel justifiably cheated. They came out and said that this remake isn't going to be much of a remake, but more so an alternative story to Final Fantasy VII. No one would buy it, because they don't want more Advent Children. They want a proper Final Fantasy VII remake. They knew this. They knew fans wanted a remake, so they called it a remake despite it not fitting that description. Again, I don't want anyone to be fired. I don't want anyone's livelihood to be put at risk, and I would never wish ill will upon anybody, but all of this could have been avoided if they'd been more upfront with the consumer. But look, I'm not trying to take away anything from you if you like this game, and honestly, I am genuinely glad that you like it and how you can find more things to love than I can. At the end of the day, I realize that I'm very much in the minority here, and that what I'm saying isn't going to have much of an impact. This game is a massive success, and everyone seems to be loving this game. I wish I could be one of those people. I really do. But after getting burned by Kingdom Hearts 3 and now this, it sucks. These were games that I've been waiting for. These are games that I've been wanting for years. And, when they got announced, I was through the roof. Like, I watched the trailers for both of these games. I followed them closely, and I was heartbroken whenever one of these games got delayed. I would talk about how excited I was for both of these games with my friends, and I would gush about them with my sister. And when the games came out, I admittedly had a bit of a honeymoon period with the first few hours. But then, as I kept playing, I started to notice more problems, and those problems only got bigger as the games went on. There came a point in both of these games where I realized I wasn't having fun, and I was asking questions, not out of intrigue, but out of frustration. Then, at the end, when I watched the credits roll for this one, I felt sad. Like, I felt crushed, honestly. Like, sad because, for a second time, a game that I've been waiting for years let me down. And when I say years, I don't just mean from announcement to release. I'm talking much further beyond that. Yeah, I was very disappointed with how Kingdom Hearts 3 turned out, but I thought, Final Fantasy VII, that's a safe bet. Nomura did say that in some ways this would be a reimagining, so, I knew going in that some things would be different, but to take it to this extreme was too much for me. And unfortunately, and I know this is going to sound silly for some of you, but this game made me lose faith in Tetsuya Nomura. This game shows that He knows what he's doing. He's fully aware, and he didn't miss the mark on accident. And as such, I have no interest in anything else that he's working on. Now, sure, if he's a character designer for a game, that's fine. That's all great. He's good at that. But if I see a game that says written and or directed by Tetsuya Nomura, game produced by Tetsuya Nomura, no, I'm not getting involved with that. I'm out. This game is a mess in my eyes. It does so much right, but at the same time, it fails to understand the importance and significance of certain characters and events. Or maybe it does understand these things, but it opts out of staying accurate for fan service. This game may be 30 hours long, but it feels so much longer than that with how much padding there is and how formulaic some of these chapters can be. The original game had issues with pacing too, but that was mostly with the random encounters and the actual speeds of the battles. What's here in the remake is a different beast altogether, and because of that, it makes me look back on the original game much more fondly. Lastly, of course, that last chapter comes out of nowhere, and it feels unsatisfying at best and downright insulting at worst, and it kills any enjoyment I would have had. I know that sounds a bit extreme, but there's a rule when it comes to writing fiction, be it a movie, a book, a game, it could be anything. There are two things that you absolutely cannot screw up. It's the beginning and it's the ending. The beginning is the consumer's first impression. It's the thing that pulls them in and makes them want to stick around. The ending is the payoff, the thing that the consumer is supposed to take away from the experience and that can entice them to come back. If you screw up either of these aspects, then your work has failed. The ending might be the most important part of your project because it's going to be the last thing that your consumer is going to remember. So if your ending sucks, that's what they're going to take away from it. And I guess with that said, it's another book that's closed by a sour ending. Maybe this whole thing was overdramatic. Honestly, who knows? I can't help what I feel, but at the end of the day, this whole spiel, this whole situation, this game has me feeling hollow.